I already found her a specialist, Renee. You don't need to be involved in this one. It's handled. My sister said that over the phone, in the particular bright, brisk voice she used whenever she wanted a conversation to be finished before it had properly started. I stood in the hallway of the audiology clinic where I've worked for 6 years, holding my own phone against my ear, listening to my sister explain to me, an audiologist, that she had personally located a hearing specialist for our grandmother without once mentioning it to me first. I asked which practice. She said a name I didn't recognize, in a town 40 minutes from where our grandmother lived, and told me, before I could ask anything else, that she really had to run. I stood in that hallway a long moment after we hung up, turning over the strange, specific discomfort of being professionally sidestepped by my own sister in the one area of expertise I actually had. I told myself it was nothing. Families do things their own way sometimes. I went back to my afternoon patients and didn't think about it again for the better part of a month. I want you to remember that phone call, because 10 weeks later, at our family's annual reunion at Miller's Lake, in front of nearly 40 relatives who had gathered under the same pavilion our family had rented every July for as long as anyone could remember, a small beige hearing aid, sitting quietly in our grandmother's right ear the entire evening, would play back a recording that ended my sister's engagement announcement, her business launch, and a story our family had spent almost a year quietly building about a sweet, slightly confused old woman who could no longer be trusted to understand her own finances. My name is Renee Ellison. I'm 33 years old, and I've spent my entire career helping people hear things clearly again, which is, I think, the only reason I eventually noticed that the person in my family whose voice mattered least to everyone else was the one person still hearing everything with perfect clarity. If you've ever had someone talk over you while claiming to be helping the person you both loved, stay with me to the end, because my grandmother taught me, long before any of this happened, that being underestimated is sometimes the safest place in the room to gather the truth. Tell me in the comments where you're watching from tonight. I read every single one. And if you're the kind of person who stays until a story's finished, subscribe now, because what that hearing aid quietly recorded took the better part of a year to gather, and it's going to take me the next 2 hours and change to tell you whyto understand what happened under that pavilion. You need to understand a house that stood on Larkspur Lane since 1974, a family reunion tradition that's run every July for 3 decades, and a set of sisterly loyalties that had been quietly settled long before either of us was old enough to argue about them. Cedar Brook, Ohio, sits about 30 minutes outside a mid-sized city, the kind of suburb where half the streets are named after flowers, and the elementary school still does a fall festival with the same 3-legged race the PTA's been running since the Reagan administration. My grandmother, Opal Ellison, and my grandfather, Wendell, bought the house on Larkspur Lane the year they married, and Opal taught 3rd grade at Cedar Brook Elementary for 34 years. The kind of teacher 3 generations of that town still stop to introduce their own children to at the grocery store. My grandfather passed in 2015. I was 22. Opal kept teaching 2 more years after that, part-time, because she told me once that a room full of 8-year-olds doesn't much care what you're grieving that particular Tuesday, and there was something about that lack of patience for her sorrow that she found, in its own strange way, kind. She had 1 son. My father, Daniel. He married my mother, Carla, in 1988, and for most of my childhood he ran a small accounting practice out of a strip mall office 2 towns over. Steady, careful work that mostly involved other people's numbers rather than his own opinions, which suited him fine, because he'd never been a man who volunteered an opinion when someone louder was already in the room. My father passed suddenly 3 years ago, a heart attack at 59, which is its own story I won't tell fully here, except to say that his absence left a particular kind of gap in this family that nobody quite filled the way he might have, had he lived to see what came next. My mother remarried the following year and moved to Arizona, which she is entitled to do, and which I don't hold against her, though it did mean that by the time any of this started, the 2 people who would ordinarily have stood closest to my grandmother, her son and her daughter-in-law, were, for entirely understandable reasons, no longer in the picture in the way they once had been. Which left my sister and me. I was born in 1992. My sister Brooke came 2 years later, and was golden in a way I understood without anyone ever having to explain it to me. There's a photograph from a 4th of July cookout when I was maybe 9. Brooke had knocked an entire bowl of potato salad off the picnic table, reaching for a slice of watermelon she'd already been handed once. My mother's exact words, and I remember them precisely because some version of them followed me my entire childhood, were, "Renee, you were standing right there, why didn't you catch it?" I was pouring lemonade 6 feet away. Nobody had assigned me to watch the potato salad. I said I was sorry anyway, because that is what you learn to do at 9 years old when the story's already been written and you're only being told which part you play in it. By the time I was 13, I understood the shape of it completely. Brooke was the one whose cheerleading competitions my parents never missed, whose prom dress cost more than my entire back-to-school wardrobe 2 years running, whose eventual setbacks, and there would be several, always arrived pre-forgiven, wrapped in some story about how ambitious, charismatic people take bigger risks and deserve softer landings. I was the reliable one, which in my family was never a compliment. It was a job description. Reliable meant nobody had to manage you. Reliable meant whatever attention was left over after Brooke's needs were met, you understood, without being told twice, that it wasn't coming your way. My grandmother never played that game. Every Sunday from the time I was 7, my father drove me to Larkspur Lane for what Opal called our appointment, though it was really just an afternoon of her testing my times tables and letting me organize her button jar by color, the kind of quiet, undemanding attention I didn't fully understand I was starving for until I was old enough to notice how rarely I got it anywhere else. "You listen before you talk," she told me once. I was maybe 11. "Your sister talks before she listens." Different gifts. But only one of them actually hears what somebody needs before they've finished asking for it. I didn't fully understand what she meant then. I understood it completely by the time I was 33. Brooke wanted nothing to do with quiet Sunday afternoons. By 18 she decided, in her words, that she was a big-picture person, which over the following 15 years translated into an unfinished business marketing degree, a multi-level cosmetics venture that cost our parents an estimated $18,000 in 2016 before it quietly folded, and, more recently, the 2 ambitions she'd been talking about at every family gathering for the past year. Her upcoming wedding to her fiancé, Adam, and a boutique day spa she wanted to open called Bloom Wellness, which needed, by her own repeated estimate, somewhere around $140,000 in startup capital she did not have and had never been asked how she planned to get. I want to be clear that I loved my sister. I still do, in the complicated way you love someone you've watched be excused from consequences her entire life and have quietly, resentfully made peace with never being excused from anything yourself. This isn't her villain origin story. That belongs to somebody else, or at least to a version of her I hadn't fully met yet. But you need to understand the machinery of this family before I show you what it was built to hide. I got my doctorate in audiology through a program 2 hours from home, and after a residency at a hospital clinic, I took a position at a private audiology practice in Cedarbrook in 2019, close enough to keep driving out to Larkspur Lane the way I always had. I make $84,000 a year, which by any reasonable measure is a perfectly good living, though it has never once impressed my mother the way Brooke's Instagram-ready spa mock-ups apparently did. I drive a 2018 Honda CR-V with a coffee stain on the passenger seat I've given up trying to get out. I am not, by any definition my mother or my sister would recognize, the exciting one. I never went looking to be. What I was, without ever deciding to be, was the only granddaughter who still drove out to Larkspur Lane nearly every single week, long after my father was gone and my mother had moved 1,800 miles away. My grandmother's memory started slipping in earnest in the winter of 2023, about 18 months after my father died. Small things at first, a name briefly gone and then back a moment later, a recipe she'd made 100 times, momentarily unfamiliar in her own handwriting, a story told twice within the same visit without her noticing. By that spring, her doctor used the word concerning. By the following fall, a geriatric specialist used the words mild cognitive impairment and told us that with routine, structure, and close attention, Opal could very reasonably continue living independently in the house on Larkspur Lane for years yet, provided somebody was watching closely on the days her judgment wasn't reliable. I want to say my sister and I adjusted together. We didn't. What actually happened is that I started stopping by 2 or 3 evenings a week after my last patient, checking on her medications, reviewing whatever mail had come that week, Sitting with her while she did the crossword, she still, remarkably, finished faster than I could. My mother called on Sundays from Arizona, warm and affectionate and 1,800 miles removed from any of the actual, granular work of watching for trouble. And my sister, who lived 12 minutes from Larkspur Lane, visited on a schedule I can only describe, in hindsight, as suspiciously aligned with whatever paperwork happened to need a signature that particular week. I don't say that to be cruel. I say it because Opal, ever the retired schoolteacher, kept a small desk calendar on her kitchen counter where she jotted who'd stopped by and when, an old habit from decades of tracking parent conferences and permission slips that she'd simply never broken. That calendar, filled in almost daily in her own increasingly careful hand, became, without my ever intending it to, one of the most honest records this family has ever produced. My initials appear on that calendar close to 200 times across roughly a year and a half. My mother's appear as phone calls, logged separately, nearly every Sunday, genuine, if distant. My sisters appear in person 9 times in that same period, 6 of which, cross-referenced against bank statements we'd only find much later, coincided within a day or two of a new account being opened or a form being notarized. Some weeks Opal was sharp as ever, beating me at gin rummy without once losing track of the score, correcting my pronunciation of a word in the crossword with the same crisp certainty she'd once corrected third graders. Other weeks she called me by my aunt's name, a sister of hers who'd passed decades earlier, and looked at me with such uncomplicated warmth that I let her. Being loved under the wrong name, I decided a long time ago, is still being loved, and I was never going to correct a woman losing pieces of herself over technicality. In late 2023, not long after her diagnosis, Brooke started raising the subject of Opal's hearing. It wasn't an unreasonable concern on its face. Opal was 78, and plenty of people that age do develop meaningful hearing loss. What struck me as strange, even then, was that Brooke brought it up to our mother and to Opal directly, multiple times, without ever once mentioning it to me, despite the fact that I quite literally test and treat hearing loss for a living and work 20 minutes from Larkspur Lane. I found someone good, Brooke told our mother on a call I happened to be present for, phone on speaker. A specialist over in Hollis Grove. Real thorough, really gentle with older patients. I already booked the consult. Renee could probably, my mother started. It's handled, Mom, Brooke said, in the bright, brisk voice I'd come to recognize as her particular way of closing a door before anyone else noticed it was swinging shut. I've got this one. I let it go. I told myself, the way I'd apparently been telling myself things about my sister my entire life, that it probably meant nothing, that maybe she simply wanted one thing, just one, that she could point to as entirely her own contribution, without her little sister the audiologist looking over her shoulder the whole time. I understand now how generous, and how wrong, that read of the situation actually was. What I didn't know that winter, what nobody knew except, I would eventually learn, one increasingly uneasy independent audiologist and one very careful attorney, was that my sister had, around that same time, begun a series of private conversations with our grandmother that had considerably less to do with hearing loss than any of us understood. My grandmother's memory started slipping in earnest in the winter of 2023, about 18 months after my father died. Small things at first, a name briefly gone and then back a moment later, a recipe she'd made 100 times, momentarily unfamiliar in her own handwriting, a story told twice within the same visit without her noticing. By that spring, her doctor used the word concerning. By the following fall, a geriatric specialist used the words mild cognitive impairment and told us that with routine, structure, and close attention, Opal could very reasonably continue living independently in the house on Larkspur Lane for years yet, provided somebody was watching closely on the days her judgment wasn't reliable. I want to say my sister and I adjusted together. We didn't. What actually happened is that I started stopping by 2 or 3 evenings a week after my last patient, checking on her medications, reviewing whatever mail had come that week, sitting with her while she did the crossword. She still, remarkably, finished faster than I could. My mother called on Sundays from Arizona, warm and affectionate and 1,800 miles removed from any of the actual, granular work of watching for trouble. And my sister, who lived 12 minutes from Larkspur Lane, visited on a schedule I can only describe, in hindsight, as suspiciously aligned with whatever paperwork happened to need a signature that particular week. I don't say that to be cruel. I say it because Opal, ever the retired schoolteacher, kept a small desk calendar on her kitchen counter where she jotted who'd stopped by and when, an old habit from decades of tracking parent conferences and permission slips that she'd simply never broken. That calendar, filled in almost daily in her own increasingly careful hand, became, without my ever intending it to, one of the most honest records this family has ever produced. My initials appear on that calendar close to 200 times across roughly a year and a half. My mother's appear as phone calls, logged separately, nearly every Sunday, genuine, if distant. My sister's appear in person 9 times in that same period, 6 of which, cross-referenced against bank statements we'd only find much later, coincided within a day or two of a new account being opened or a form being notarized. Some weeks Opal was sharp as ever, beating me at gin rummy without once losing track of the score, correcting my pronunciation of a word in the crossword with the same crisp certainty she'd once corrected third graders. Other weeks she called me by my aunt's name, a sister of hers who'd passed decades earlier, and looked at me with such uncomplicated warmth that I let her. Being loved under the wrong name, I decided a long time ago, is still being loved, and I was never going to correct a woman losing pieces of herself over technicality. In late 2023, not long after her diagnosis, Brooke started raising the subject of Opal's hearing. It wasn't an unreasonable concern on its face. Opal was 78, and plenty of people that age do develop meaningful hearing loss. What struck me as strange, even then, was that Brooke brought it up to our mother and to Opal directly, multiple times, without ever once mentioning it to me, despite the fact that I quite literally test and treat hearing loss for a living and work 20 minutes from Larkspur Lane. I found someone good, Brooke told our mother on a call I happened to be present for, phone on speaker. A specialist over in Hollis Grove. Real thorough, really gentle with older patients. I already booked the consult. Renee could probably, my mother started. It's handled, Mom, Brooke said, in the bright, brisk voice I'd come to recognize as her particular way of closing a door before anyone else noticed it was swinging shut. I've got this one. I let it go. I told myself, the way I'd apparently been telling myself things about my sister my entire life, that it probably meant nothing, that maybe she simply wanted one thing, just one, that she could point to as entirely her own contribution, without her little sister the audiologist looking over her shoulder the whole time. I understand now how generous, and how wrong, that read of the situation actually was. What I didn't know that winter, what nobody knew except, I would eventually learn, one increasingly uneasy independent audiologist and one very careful attorney, was that my sister had, around that same time, begun a series of private conversations with our grandmother that had considerably less to do with hearing loss than any of us understood. The first thing I actually noticed and genuinely couldn't explain away, was small. In February, I stopped by Larkspur Lane on a Wednesday evening, not my usual night that week, to drop off a prescription refill. Brooke's car was in the driveway. Through the front window, before either of them noticed me, I watched her sitting at Opal's kitchen table with a laptop open and a folder of papers, walking Opal through something on the screen with the particular unhurried, solicitous patience of someone who wanted to look, to anyone watching, exactly like a caring granddaughter helping her grandmother with something complicated. Just helping Grandma set up online banking, she told me, a little too quickly, when I came in. It's so much easier for her this way. I didn't think much of it then. In March, my mother mentioned, on one of our Sunday calls, that Brooke had told her she was handling some of Grandma's account consolidation, since she gets confused with too many statements coming in now. I asked which accounts. My mother said she wasn't entirely sure, something about combining a few CDS, and asked how my week had been. In April, Brooke posted an engagement announcement, she and Adam, gorgeous professional photos at a vineyard, a caption about starting this next chapter surrounded by everyone who's believed in us, and, within the same week, a soft launch teaser for Bloom Wellness, a mood board of marble countertops and eucalyptus branches, captioned "Big things coming this fall, thank you to the family who made this possible." I want to be honest about something. None of this, on its own, would have made me suspicious. Families help each other. Grandmothers help pay for weddings. I'm not a person who assumes the worst about people by default. Ask any patient who sat across from me while I fit them for their very first hearing aid, I am, if anything, famously patient about giving people the benefit of the doubt. What changed my mind wasn't any single fact. It was the accumulation of small, specific, unexplained gaps between what I was being told and what I could plainly see with my own eyes on that kitchen calendar every single week. The gap that finally cracked it open was a hearing aid fitting appointment. In early May, I stopped by Larkspur Lane and found Opal at her kitchen table with a small, unfamiliar case beside her teacup. A pair of modern, rechargeable hearing aids, sleek and beige, still in their charging dock. "Brooke's friend fit me for these," Opal said, when I asked. "Nice young woman, over in Hollis Grove. Grace, I believe." I asked to see the paperwork. Opal handed me a folder without hesitation, and inside I found a hearing evaluation, a fitting invoice for $3,400. Reasonable enough for a mid-range digital hearing aid, nothing alarming on its face, and, tucked behind it, a photocopy of a form I did not expect to see at all, a durable power of attorney, dated the previous month, naming my sister sole agent over all of Opal Allison's financial and property decisions. I called Brooke from my car in the driveway, staring at that photocopy like it was written in a language I didn't recognize yet. "Brooke, there's a power of attorney in Grandma's folder with your name on it. When did this happen?" "Oh, that. Breezy, almost bored. It's just a formality, Renee, in case something happens and somebody needs to make quick decisions. You know how it is with her memory lately. It made sense for me to be the one, since I'm closest and I've been the one handling most of this. I'd like to hear her explain it to me herself. She's tired today. Maybe another time." I sat with my grandmother 4 days later. It was, by her own standards that spring, a good day, alert, oriented, telling me about a former student of hers who'd just made partner at a law firm downtown with the same pride she'd have had for one of her own grandchildren. I asked her, as gently as I knew how, about the power of attorney. She went very still. The particular stillness of a woman trying to catch hold of a thought that keeps sliding just out of reach the moment she closes her hand around it. "Brooke keeps bringing me things to sign," she said finally, staring at the window instead of at me. "I taught 3rd grade for 34 years, Renee. I know what it looks like when somebody wants you to sign before you've had the chance to sound out every word. I'm not signing paper I haven't read all the way through, just because your grandfather's gone and nobody's grading my homework anymore." "What things, Grandma? What's she asking you to sign?" She didn't answer that part directly. Instead, without any transition I could follow, she reached up and gently touched the hearing aid in her right ear. "This one hears things I don't always catch the first time," she said, an odd, careful precision in her voice that struck me, even then, as somehow deliberate. "Grace showed me. There's more to it than just making things louder. You'll understand, when it's time." I didn't press her further that evening. I drove home turning that strange phrase over and over, "There's more to it than just making things louder," telling myself it was simply the confusion the doctors had warned us about, a sentence that didn't quite track the way sentences sometimes stopped quite tracking for her now. If you've ever had someone tell you something important in language you weren't ready to fully understand yet, tell me in the comments. You are absolutely not alone, and I was about to spend the rest of that year learning exactly how not alone. The thing that finally made me stop being polite about any of it happened in early July, 3 weeks before the reunion. I stopped by Larkspur Lane and found a real estate agent's card on the kitchen counter, tucked half under a fruit bowl, from an agency I didn't recognize, with a handwritten note on the back, "Thanks for considering us for the condo listing. Call anytime, Marnie." Opal had lived in that house for 50 years. There was no condo. Unless, I understood with a cold, sinking certainty, somebody was already planning what came after she no longer did. I drove straight to the audiology clinic in Hollis Grove the following morning, the one whose fitting invoice I'd found in Opal's folder, and asked to speak with Grace Liu. She saw me without an appointment, which by itself should have told me something. "You must be Renee," she said, before I'd even fully introduced myself. She didn't look surprised. She looked like someone who'd been expecting this exact visit for a while. "Sit down." I asked her, my hands not quite steady in my lap, why my grandmother had come to her specifically, rather than to me, given that I worked 20 minutes away and was, professionally, exactly the kind of provider Opal should have seen first. Grace was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Your sister brought her in. Paid for the visit herself. And I want to be honest with you about something that's been sitting badly with me for months, because I think you're the reason your grandmother came back to see me alone, twice, after that first visit." She pulled up Opal's file on her computer. The first visit, your sister stayed in the room the entire time, answered most of the intake questions herself, and specifically requested a model with an app-connected environmental memory feature. It's meant for patients who want to review sound settings later, adjust for restaurants versus quiet rooms, that kind of thing. Perfectly normal feature. But your grandmother came back alone, twice, in the weeks after, and both times she asked me very specific, very careful questions about exactly how that feature worked. How long a recording could run. Whether it's saved automatically. Whether anyone else could access it remotely. I sat with that for a long moment. The third time she came in, Grace said, she told me, plainly, that she believed her granddaughter was taking advantage of her, and that she wanted to understand her own hearing aids well enough to use them to protect herself. I am not a lawyer, and I told her so. But I showed her, in detail, exactly how the recording feature worked, how to trigger it discreetly, and how to retrieve the files through the companion app on her own tablet, because she asked me to, clearly and with full understanding, and I did not think it was my place to refuse a woman who was, by every measure I could see in that room, entirely lucid about what she was asking for and why. I asked her if she'd tell an attorney what she'd just told me. "I've been hoping somebody would ask," Grace said. That same afternoon, I drove to the office of Colette Ferreira, an estate attorney 2 towns over who Opal had used for her original will decades earlier, a connection I found only because her name turned up in an old file box in Opal's hall closet. Colette agreed to see me the following morning. "I haven't drafted anything for Opal Ellison in over 15 years, Colette told me, pulling a thin, dusty folder with Opal Ellison typed on the tab. "Which tells me whatever your sister filed with the county was drafted by someone else entirely." She pulled up the county recorder's site on her monitor and searched. Within a minute, she found it, a durable power of attorney filed in April, naming Brooke Ellison sole agent, notarized by a name neither of us recognized. "Perry Lund," Colette read aloud, tapping the seal. "I've practiced in this county for over 20 years. I don't know that name, which in itself is unusual for a notary who claims to be doing volume work for estate documents." She pulled the state notary registry. Lund's commission, it turned out, had lapsed 11 months before the date on the document. "This is enough to be genuinely concerned," Colette said. "It is not, on its own, enough to build a case that survives a family arguing both sides were simply generous and confused. What would help enormously is anything showing your grandmother had clear capacity during this exact period, and any direct account of what your sister actually told her while asking her to sign." I told her about the hearing aids. About Grace Liu. About the strange, careful sentence Opal had said to me, "There's more to it than just making things louder." Colette went very still. "Renee," she said slowly, "I think you need to go home and ask your grandmother, very directly, whether that hearing aid has been recording anything, and if so, whether she's willing to let you hear it." I drove to Larkspur Lane that same evening. Opal was in the kitchen, doing the crossword with the radio on low. I sat down across from her and asked her plainly, the way Colette had suggested, whether the hearing aids had been recording anything, and whether she'd let me hear it. She set down her pencil. She looked at me for a long moment with an expression I hadn't seen from her in months. Sharp, entirely present, unmistakably her own. "I wondered how long it would take you to ask me directly instead of tiptoeing around it," she said. "Get my tablet. It's in the drawer by the toaster. I've been waiting for you to be ready to actually listen, Renee, not just worry from a distance." What followed, over the next several hours, sitting at that kitchen table with her tablet propped between us, was 11 separate recordings, some only a few minutes, some running the better part of an hour, captured over 9 months through the environmental memory feature in a hearing aid my sister had personally arranged, in the specific hope, I have to assume, that a woman with mild cognitive impairment would never think to use it against her. The first recording was dated in January, weeks after the fitting. Opal's voice, close to the microphone, quiet and deliberate. "This is Opal Ellison. I am recording this on purpose, Because my granddaughter Brooke has started bringing me papers I am not permitted to read at my own pace, and because I taught 3rd grade long enough to recognize exactly what it looks like when somebody wants a signature before the reading comprehension has finished. I intend to listen very carefully from now on, and I intend to remember everything I hear, whether or not my memory agrees to cooperate on its own. The second recording captured an actual conversation, Brooke's voice unmistakable, warm and rehearsed in the particular way I now recognized from a lifetime of watching her manage people. "This is just the standard form, Grandma. It lets me help you faster if anything ever comes up. You trust me, right? You know I'd never do anything that wasn't in your best interest." A pause, papers shuffling. "Right here, and then here. You don't even have to read the whole thing, it's boilerplate, everybody signs the same version." The fourth recording, from February, caught a phone call Brooke had apparently taken in the next room, believing Opal couldn't follow it closely enough to matter. "The venue deposit's due next month," Brooke's voice said, tight and stressed in a register I'd genuinely never heard from her before. "And the lease on the Bloom space, if we don't sign by the 15th we lose the spot." I know, I'm working on it. Grandma's good for it, she just doesn't always remember the conversations, so I have to kind of walk her through it fresh sometimes. It's not like I'm hiding anything, she agreed to help. The sixth recording, from March, was the one that made me set down my tea and sit very still at that kitchen table. Opal's voice, this time, addressed directly and clearly to whoever might eventually listen. I want it said plainly, on a machine that will remember it even on the days I can't. I have not agreed to fund a spa. I have not agreed to a wedding beyond the $2,000 I offered outright. Gladly, the week she got engaged. Whatever my granddaughter tells anyone I've agreed to, I want my own voice on the record saying I did not agree to it with a clear understanding of the actual numbers involved. The eighth recording, from May, named a figure that made the shape of the whole scheme finally click into place. "She had me sign something today she called a transfer authorization," Opal said, her voice steady but clipped with something close to anger. "I did not understand at the time what it authorized. I have since asked my bank for a statement, which I requested myself, in person, without her knowledge, and I now understand that $131,000 has left my retirement account since January. That is not confusion on my part. That is a very deliberate use of confusion that isn't fully mine." The ninth recording, from June, was quieter, more tired, though no less clear. "I have moved what remains into an account my granddaughter does not know exists, set up through a bank 2 towns over, with the help of a manager there who was kind enough to walk an old woman through the paperwork slowly, the way it should have been done for me from the start. Whatever is left, along with this house, belongs to Renee. It always should have. She is the only one who has spent the last year actually listening to me instead of talking over me, and I have thought about almost nothing else these past months except making sure that gets said clearly, in my own voice, before I lose the words to say it any other way." The 10th recording, from late June, addressed the coming reunion directly. "If there is a day this needs to be said loudly instead of quietly, let it be the reunion. Every single person who matters to this family will be under that pavilion in July, same as every July. Your grandfather used to say the truth doesn't need volume, it just needs a room that can't talk over it. That pavilion is the room. If this isn't finished by then, that's where you finish it." The 11th and final recording, from 3 days before I sat down with that tablet, was barely a minute long, her voice slower than in the earlier ones, though the words landed with the same weight. "Last thing. Whatever anyone tells a court about my mind, I have kept this kitchen calendar in my own hand nearly every day for a year and a half, and I have asked my own bank, on my own initiative, for statements no one told me to request. A mind too confused to manage its own affairs does not go looking for the truth on its own. Mine did. That is the whole argument, and I built it slowly, the way I built 34 years of lesson plans, so that it would hold up under anyone's scrutiny." I sat at that kitchen table a very long time after the last recording ended. Then I called Colette Ferreira, and she picked up on the second ring, well past 9 at night, which told me everything about how long she, too, had been waiting for exactly this call. "This is enough to open an investigation," Colette told me the next morning, the tablet and its 11 recordings sitting between us like an exhibit already halfway assembled. But enough to open one and enough to win one are different animals, and I want to hand the county something so complete they don't have room to argue it away as sisterly generosity gone slightly overboard. Give me 6 weeks. I know the reunion is in 3. I promise you it's enough time, once you see what we're about to build. What followed was the strangest, quietest, most disciplined 3 weeks of my life. Colette brought in a forensic accountant named Desmond Okafor, a calm, exacting man who had spent over 20 years untangling exactly this kind of thing for family estates across the region. Within 10 days, working from bank records subpoenaed through the county's Adult Protective Services Division, he'd traced a pattern that made Opal's own recorded figure look, if anything, conservative. Between January and that June, $187,000 had moved out of accounts connected to Opal Ellison. The $131,000 Opal herself had already identified, plus an additional $56,000 routed more quietly through a joint account Brooke had opened using the forged power of attorney, structured as a shared household fund that had, on closer inspection, covered a vineyard wedding deposit, 4 months of build-out costs for the Bloom Wellness lease, and a down payment on a car. In Adam's name. Your sister's spa lease and the wedding deposits, Desmond told me, sliding a printout across the table, account for roughly $160,000 of this total, drawn from accounts belonging to a woman who, according to her own daily kitchen calendar and her own bank inquiry history, was actively and independently tracking her own finances for nearly this entire period. I asked, because I had to, whether Adam knew. That's the part numbers can't answer for me, Desmond said. That's a question for a person, not a spreadsheet. Colette pulled Opal's kitchen calendar, the same one I'd watched her fill in almost daily for a year and a half, and laid it beside Desmond's financial timeline. The 2 documents, in their own separate languages, told exactly the same story. My visits logged nearly 200 times, my mother's Sunday calls noted faithfully, my sister's 9 in-person visits, 6 of which lined up within a day or 2 of a new account opening or a notarization. And laid beside it, a withdrawal timeline that accelerated sharply in exactly the months my sister's visits had clustered. She also, quietly, tracked down the notary. Perry Lund turned out to be a real person, a retired insurance adjuster who had let his commission lapse and had, according to his own statement to Colette's investigator, helped a young woman named Brooke with some paperwork for a flat fee, no questions asked, at a coffee shop off the highway. A fact he became considerably less relaxed about once he understood exactly what that paperwork had been used for. He agreed to a sworn statement in exchange for immunity on his own small piece of the exposure. Grace Liu, the audiologist, gave a formal statement as well, walking Colette's investigator through the same account she'd given me. Brooke's insistence on the environmental memory feature, Opal's later solo visits, and her own decision to explain the recording function fully to a patient she'd assessed, professionally and repeatedly, as entirely capable of understanding what she was asking for. There was one more piece, and it came from a source I hadn't expected, though in hindsight I should have. Loretta Shaw had lived 2 doors down from Larkspur Lane for over 30 years, close enough with Opal that she still came by most Fridays for coffee, a tradition older than my own memory of the street. She called me on her own, in early July, once word had quietly begun moving through the family that something was being looked into. I want you to know I saw the real estate woman's car out front twice this spring, Loretta told me. I mentioned it to Brooke once, at the mailbox. She told me I must be thinking of somebody else's house. Renee, honey, I have looked at that driveway every single morning for 31 years. I know exactly whose car was parked in it. She agreed, without my having to ask twice, to give a statement of her own. By the 3rd week of July, Colette had assembled a file nearly 3 inches thick, the forged power of attorney, the lapsed and misused notary commission, Desmond's financial timeline, Opal's own kitchen calendar, Grace Liu's professional statement, Loretta's account of the real estate agent's visits, and 11 recordings spanning 9 months, in a sharp, deliberate, entirely lucid woman's own voice, describing in real time the exact scheme unfolding around her. I've done this work for over 20 years, Colette told me, closing the folder. I have rarely, if ever, seen a case document itself this completely, using a tool nobody involved ever imagined would be turned around and pointed straight back at them. Your grandmother built this the same patient, careful way she once built 34 years of lesson plans. Slow. deliberate, and exactly strong enough to hold. I want to pause here, because I don't think this story is honest if I let you believe my sister's fiancé was simply an accessory standing quietly beside her while she did all the work. It's more complicated than that, and I think complicated is closer to true. I met Adam for coffee in mid-July, 10 days before the reunion, before Colette had said a word to anyone else. I hadn't planned to tell him anything. I told myself I just wanted to see his face when I asked one simple question. He looked tired in a way that had nothing to do with wedding planning stress, dark circles, a phone he kept turning face down on the table like he was actively trying not to check it, the particular hollowed-out exhaustion of a man watching two enormous financial commitments come due at once with no clear sense of where the money underneath either of them had actually come from. The vineyard wants the balance in 3 weeks, he told me, before I'd even asked anything, apparently just needing to say it out loud to somebody who wasn't going to ask him for a decision in response. And the spa build-out's already over budget. I keep asking Brooke how it's all coming together and she keeps telling me not to worry about it, that her grandmother's been incredibly generous. I've met your grandmother exactly twice, Renee. I didn't want to be the guy asking uncomfortable questions about an elderly woman's finances at Thanksgiving. Do you know where the money's actually coming from, Adam? He looked at me a long moment, and something in his face, not guilt exactly, but the ragged edge of a question he'd clearly been declining to finish asking himself for a while, answered before he said a word. I know it's coming from her, he said finally, quietly, not meeting my eyes. I told myself it wasn't my business to ask how much, or how it was being arranged, because Brooke made it sound like it was already all settled and agreed to, like I'd be insulting a generous old woman by questioning it. He rubbed his face with both hands. I'm not going to sit here and pretend I asked the hard questions. I didn't. I took the easy answer because the easy answer let the wedding stay on track. I told him what Colette had found. I told him about the hearing aid, the forged signature, the notary at a coffee shop off the highway, the kitchen calendar with my sister's 9 visits lined up neatly against $187,000 in withdrawals. I watched Adam, 29 years old, 3 weeks from his own wedding, sit very still across that coffee shop table, absorbing the fact that the vineyard deposit he was about to help pay the balance on had been funded, at least in significant part, by money taken from a woman who could no longer fully defend her own signature. What happens now? He asked, and it wasn't only a question about himself. It was the question of someone realizing, all at once, that willful blindness carries its own bill, even when someone else arranged the transfer. I told him the truth, because he deserved that much. I didn't know what would happen to the wedding, or to his relationship with my sister, or to him specifically. That was between him and Brooke, and eventually the county. What I did know was that he had 2 choices sitting right in front of him at that table. Keep protecting a story he now understood wasn't fully true, or start asking the questions he should have asked months earlier. 2 days later, on his own, without my asking, he called Colette's office and gave a voluntary statement, confirming the timeline of the vineyard deposit and the spa build-out exactly as he understood it, without either defending or condemning my sister, simply telling the truth as plainly as he could. It didn't undo what had already been spent. But it was, I think, the first fully honest thing anyone adjacent to this situation had done since it started, and I've never once regretted telling him before the reunion instead of letting him find out with everyone else under that pavilion by the last week of July. Colette's file had moved to Renata Klein, an investigator with the county's Adult Protective Services Division who specialized, as she put it to me in our first meeting, in the cases where the whole family insists it couldn't possibly be that bad, right up until it very clearly was. Renata reviewed everything over the course of 5 days, the recordings, Desmond's financial timeline, Grace Liu's professional statement, Loretta's account, Perry Lund's sworn statement about the coffee shop notarization, Adam's voluntary statement, Opal's kitchen calendar. She came back with a straightforward assessment. Elder financial exploitation exceeding $150,000 was a felony in this state carrying significant prison time, and forgery of a notarized instrument was a separate charge entirely. Combined, she told Colette, this was one of the more thoroughly self-documented cases I've seen cross my desk in years, thanks in no small part to a woman who figured out how to turn her own hearing aid into a witness. The warrant application went to the county court in the first days of August, timed deliberately around the reunion date, which fell that year on the second Saturday of the month. It was signed within days. The timing works in our favor, Renata told us, the three of us sitting with a calendar between us. If your grandmother wanted this handled in front of the whole family, we can make that happen exactly the way her recordings describe. Officers in plain clothes, ready on my signal, present but not visible until it matters. I asked her, because I had to, what would happen to my mother, who'd been 1,800 miles away this entire time. That's not really my question to answer, Renata said, not unkindly. It's the courts, eventually. Though I'll tell you the distance itself isn't nothing in a case like this. What I can tell you is that the evidence in this file focuses very specifically on direct action, and your mother's fingerprints, so to speak, aren't on any of it. I spent the days before the reunion doing something I hadn't done in a long time. I drove out on a Wednesday, not my usual visiting rhythm, just to sit with my grandmother at her kitchen table. She was having a good day, sharp, present, beating me at gin rummy twice in a row without apparent effort. At one point, setting down her cards, she said, without any obvious connection to what we'd been talking about, "Did you finally listen to all of it?" "I listened to every single one, Grandma." She smiled, small, satisfied, the same smile, I imagine, she once gave a struggling student who'd finally sounded out a difficult word entirely on their own. "Good," she said. "Then it's done. Whatever happens now, it's already done. I built it slowly enough that it would hold." Our family's reunion happens the second Saturday of every July, under the same lakeside pavilion my grandfather's siblings started renting back in the early 90s. Folding tables end to end, a volleyball net nobody's used seriously in a decade, and, that particular year, an announcement my sister had been planning for months. She'd arranged, weeks earlier, to gather everyone together around 4 o'clock and formally announce both the wedding date and the opening of Bloom Wellness, framed, in the toast she'd clearly rehearsed, as this incredible new chapter, made possible by the most generous woman any of us have ever known. What she did not know was that the vineyard's final balance had quietly gone unpaid 4 days earlier, the vineyard's coordinator having received, at Colette's direction, formal notice of a pending asset freeze tied to an active elder exploitation investigation, and the Bloom Wellness lease had been placed on hold by the landlord for the same reason that same week. I stood near the back of the pavilion with Colette and Renata Klein, Adam beside me, unusually quiet, his hands folded tightly in his lap. Loretta Shaw stood a few feet away in her good sun hat, arms crossed, watching my sister step up in front of the gathered tables with the expression of a woman who had been waiting a long time to see something finished properly.